Okay, so that's recording. For those of you who don't know me, I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established a couple of years ago in memory of the late British historian. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces to the centre with us today, and also lots of new faces. So thank you for joining us. In addition to being the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, Sir Martin Gilbert, of course, published many books, fully 88 books on a wide range of topics, including very influential accounts of the 20th century, of the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the modern Jewish experience, the history of Israel, and other topics. And he also published a series of pioneering historical atlases. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but he also had an amazing ability to bring history alive to his audiences. And so our aim at the center, in keeping with that, is to bring the finest historical research to a broad non-academic public and make that history accessible and exciting. Those of you who have joined us before will know that we offer quite a wide program of events across the year on many of the subjects that Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So please do join our mailing list. I'll put a link in the chat so that we can let you know about some of our forthcoming events. Today, we are very pleased and privileged to be able to host Dr. Jennifer Craig Norton, who will be talking to us about her fantastic research on the Kindertransport. Jennifer is an honorary fellow of the Parkes Institute at the University of Southampton, and her publications include, among others, a book titled The Kindertransport, Contesting Memory, and I'll put a link in the chat also to that book, which was published in 2019 by Indiana University Press, where you can find more information about it. She's also the co-editor of Migrant Histories and Historiographies with Christard Hoffman and Tony Kushner. And she's currently working on a book about Jewish refugee domestics and nurses between 1938 and 1950. So if any of you have personal stories on that topic, I'm sure she'd also be very glad to hear from you. Jennifer will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, as usual, we will open up the floor for questions and comments. And please feel free to post your questions in the chat, either publicly or privately to me, and I will convey those questions to Jennifer afterwards. So without much further ado, I will pass over to Jennifer now. Her talk is titled The Kindertransport, Contesting Memory.
Okay, hope everyone can hear me now. Thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to see so many people who are interested in hearing what I hope is some new information about the Kindertransport. And thank you to Shirley for inviting me to give this talk tonight. And as she mentioned, I welcome emails. My email should be on this first slide. It's not, but if you contact Shirley, she will give you my email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that don't get answered tonight. Or if you have any Kindertransport or Jewish refugee domestic stories, I'm always interested in those as well. I'm going to start just by letting you know that I have no personal connection to the Kindertransport, that my interest in the Kindertransport, which I have been researching it for well over a decade now, began because I was a teacher in California, and I did outreach work for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Kindertransport was being taught in schools as part of the Holocaust curriculum, and always in a very positive light as a heartwarming story of rescue. And it was in encountering the way it was being discussed that I began to question its basic narrative. As I learned a little bit more about the Kindertransport, I discovered that there were numerous autobiographical accounts and very few academic accounts of the Kindertransport. And the narrative can kind of well be summed up by this quote, which came from a very small pamphlet published during the war by the Refugee Children's Movement, which was the major refugee committee that looked after the children. And these are this is the final paragraph of this small pamphlet that just sort of summed up the work of the Refugee Children's Movement. And this has become the sort of paradigmatic account of the Kindertransport, that the British people and the British government gave 10,000 children the opportunity to grow up in an atmosphere of decency and normality, to work, play, laugh, and be happy, and assume their rightful heritage as free men and women. There are, as this screen shows, just a tiny number of the accounts about the Kindertransport. There are thousands of testimonies from Kindertransportees, and often these accounts tell a very different story. And I began to question why their stories didn't make much of an impact on this narrative of the Kindertransport as this act of humanitarian rescue and very little else. To show how durable this narrative is, I'm going to put this quote up. This was a part of a newspaper article that the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote in 2015, around the time of the height of the European refugee crisis from the Middle East. And he said the last few days have brought back images we thought we would never see again. They take our mind back to the Holocaust. And it's important to remember simple humanitarian gestures like the Kindertransport, which rescued 10,000 children and lit a light in the darkest period of history. So even as recently as this, you can see that this narrative is the dominant one. There is, as I said, a paucity of academic work on the Kindertransport. So I decided that I was going to devote some academic time into researching it. And this was the result, which was published a couple of years ago. I was fortunate in researching this book to come across some archival collections that had never been used at all in Kindertransport research. There had widely been thought that the records of the Kindertransportees had been destroyed. Many of them have been, but even to this day, what remains from the Refugee Children's Movement is largely inaccessible to researchers. There was some movement in making these things accessible just before the pandemic, so most researchers have not seen many of these documents. And what the Refugee Children's Movement kept was not the original correspondence about these children, but just these, they're called logs of contact. So these do exist for most Kindertransportees, and a great deal of information can be gleaned from records like this, but it's not quite the same as the kind of materials that I discovered in the archives at Southampton University, which were the case files of about almost 300 children who had been brought by several different agencies to the United Kingdom on various different Kindertransports. And you can just see this is a sort of collage of the kinds of things that were in these archival collections. So photographs and letters from refugee organizations, letters from the foster parents, letters from the children themselves, letters from the parents. Most of these, and the basis for my book, are the case files of about 100 children who were brought here by a very small agency. And you can see one document at the top here, the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund. These were German-born children who had been expelled with their families out of Germany to Poland in October 28th, 29th, 1939. This was something called the Poland Action. And upwards of about 20,000 Polish Jews were expelled from Germany over those 2 days. And so the records of this British fund, which started out just raising money to help the refugees, but then after the Kindertransport...
Right, in the fruit.
became once it became possible to bring children, they decided to try and bring children in through the Kindertransport, and they accomplished. They brought almost 200 children in, and I found about 125 of their files. And so it was through this documentation that I was able to investigate a lot of unexplored subjects, a lot of new information about refugee agencies, how they related to one another, how they related to the children under their care, how the children related to them, all from their correspondence back and forth. Quite a bit of new information about foster carers and their motivations and how they treated the children, and a lot of new information about the children, how they felt about their own situation, how they advocated for themselves, their worries, their concerns, their complaints, the things they were grateful for, all from correspondence that they wrote at the time. And finally, and very importantly, I think in the last chapter of my book is devoted to this, information about the parents, which have been generally largely left out of the Kindertransport story. I also, in the course of this research, managed to find recorded interviews and some written memoirs by some of these children whose files I had located. And then I embarked on a search for as many of them as I could find. And I found several dozen and several dozen more of their families. So I was able to interview a lot of these former Kindertransportees and or their families. And that added a whole another dimension to my research. So tonight, what I would like to do is address some misunderstandings about the Kindertransport and hopefully to bring some information that challenges this very simplistic narrative of rescue and salvation. One of the things that is widely misunderstood about the Kindertransport is that it was the perception that it was a government-sponsored scheme, which it was not. After Kristallnacht, which actually followed on and is related to the Poland action, a delegation of religious leaders, Jewish and non-Jewish, came to the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary and pleaded with them to allow the entrance of unaccompanied children. And you can see from this quote, there was quite a famous speech now famous, on the 21st of November, 1938, in which the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, in just a few minutes, it takes a couple of paragraphs to read it, basically set in motion what became known as the Kindertransport. And this is what he said about the government's role. The organizations told me that they would be prepared to bring here all the children whose maintenance would be guaranteed. All that will probably be necessary will be for the Home Office to give the necessary visas and facilitate their entry. And in fact, that's all the government perceived that they were going to do at that point. They weren't going to help immigrate these children or look after them once they were here. In the event, the refugee agencies ran out of money during the war, and the government did begin to financially support them and the children. But for the first couple of years of the program, it was an all-volunteer effort, and there was no government involvement at all, except that children under the age of 14 were allowed to attend school, state schools, for free. Sir Samuel Hoare also addressed the parents in this short speech he made about bringing unaccompanied children here. And he said, "I could not help thinking what a terrible dilemma it was to Jewish parents in Germany to have to choose between sending their children to a foreign country into the unknown and continuing to live in the terrible conditions to which they are now reduced in Germany." And here he really hits at the fundamental question of the Kindertransport. Was it humane to bring the children but not their parents? These pictures that you can see are stills from a quite famous and rare footage of children that were leaving with Sir Nicholas Winton from Prague. And I think you can see from the look on the parents' faces just how traumatizing it was to send their children away into the unknown. So I think it's very interesting when you think about what Hoare said here, that the Kindertransport has almost unambiguously been described as this rescue scheme, this humanitarian rescue, when it could also be framed as a government-mandated family separation scheme, because in fact, family separation was the ultimate outcome of the Kindertransport. And family separation was deeply traumatic for these children, many of whom never really recovered from the loss of their families. And in fact, the majority of them did lose their families and never saw them again. This is a famous picture of the Kindertransport, and it actually happens to be the first group of children who came from Poland. One of the reasons it's so famous is there are very few pictures of children disembarking from ships, but this ship, which came from Gdynia, sailed right up the Thames and docked right under Tower Bridge, so it was quite accessible to the London papers. And you can see here the first group of children coming from Poland. So I want to talk about some of the aspects of family separation that affected these children from the minute that they took leave of their families. And one of these was the fact that children no longer had their families to look after them, to advise them, to guide them, to love them, and care for them. And as it turned out, refugee agencies and foster carers, hostel matrons and masters and so forth, however well-intentioned and well-meaning, were no substitute for their own parents. Kindertransport autobiographical accounts often discuss how their ambitions were thwarted. Many of them rue the fact that their educations were ended far earlier than they would have wanted or had expected that they would be. There are many accounts of children whose foster parents refused to allow them to take the 11+ exam, older children who were not afforded any schooling at all and put straight to work at the age of 14. These accounts are seconded by recollections of people involved with the Kindertransport, and they have to do with the attitudes that were embedded in these people who ran the refugee agencies. And these attitudes had to do with class, how people felt about refugees in general, and these children in particular. This first quote is from Elaine Blond, who was one of the founders of the refugee children's movement, about another woman, the Marchioness of Reading, who was also a founder. And she was recalling that the Marchioness used to say that refugees were deserving sympathy and help, but not to be pampered, that they came from the lower strata in society and could not expect or even appreciate the finer things in life. It's rather ironic that she would have said this, because the majority of these children came from middle class or lower middle class families. This other quote is from the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund files, and it quite echoes what the Marchioness was saying. This was Elsie Zeitlund, who was a king's counselor, and he was a founder of the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund, writing to one of the committees that had established a hostel for some of the girls from Poland. And he said to him, I'm afraid we are inclined to spoil the children instead of preparing them to see life as it is. And life as it is was this. This is Zeitlund again, talking about a young boy named Bruno Nussbaum, who desperately, as you can see from this quote, wanted to become an architect. And he had been evacuated to Worthing, and he asked to be enrolled at the Worthing School of Arts and Crafts. And the Worthing committee that was looking after him was quite in favor of the idea, but they needed money to do this. And this was Elsie Zeitlund's response. As far as my memory serves me, he shows no special ability to justify this fund seconding this boy's desires. My own ideal is to have the boys taught a handicraft rather than a profession. Personally, I'm all for the crafts. It's the artisan rather than the artist I should like to help produce. So these very clear attitudes towards refugees and what they could expect of life once they came to England meant that very, very few of them were able to continue on in school past the age of 15. There is one exception, a group of children that were sponsored by the West London Synagogue, whose files I also have extensively looked at, and they brought about 100 children over as well. They sent most of their children to boarding schools. However, even they, you can see from their records here, fell into these ways of thinking about these refugee children. You can see in these forms that they classified each child as middle class, good class, professional class, and then there's one that's even called simple. I'm not quite sure what that means. One, it says mothers in service here. And so here's a quote from one of the staff of the hospitality committee at the West London Synagogue, writing about 3 girls who were staying with the gardener on the estate of a woman named Lady Fitzgerald. And so she says, Rosalie Weisberg is a very attractive girl, but not of a very good class. Her mother was a little dressmaker in Vienna. Erica Sherrick is a good middle class. Her father was a cabinet maker in Vienna, and her brother's a dentist. And Elsbeth Hirstein is a very good class child and doing remarkably well at school. It probably won't surprise you to know that Elsbeth was allowed to stay on in school, whereas Rosalie found a job as soon as she turned 14. In fact, Elsbeth is quite the exception. These are some clips from an exhibition that I made for the West London Synagogue about the work of their hospitality committee. And they include some pictures that were lent to me by Elsbeth's family. As far as I know, she is still alive, actually. And she was enabled to go all the way through and graduated from Oxford, from Somerville College in 1946. Her parents were alive. They had made it to America, and she eventually joined them in 1947 and became a social worker. But I think, and even this letter at the top from Lady Fitzgerald says that she is an exception. She should be treated as an exception. And really, this is quite an exceptional case. But I did want to include that because it was possible if you had a wealthy and invested patron to go on to university. Another area in which I think the Kindred Transport needs some really critical attention is the area of religion. What I discovered was that younger children, especially, were prone to be placed in families where they were proselytized at the worst, or just estranged from their religion because of no exposure to Judaism. More than half of the Jewish children were placed in non-Jewish homes. And then that number actually increased when they were evacuated to the countryside, and there were really virtually no Jewish placements. So I think it can be said that the majority of Kindred transportees grew up in an atmosphere that was not particularly Jewish. Again, this is an account by Elaine Blond, and she was justifying this putting children in non-Jewish homes, saying that beggars can't be choosers, and help was welcome from wherever, and that her conscience was clear, knowing we were not turning children away on spurious grounds of religious incompatibility. Elaine Blond was Jewish, but she came from a liberal Jewish tradition, and there was a lot of resistance to this attitude from the more Orthodox quarters in Britain, especially from Solomon Schoenfeld, who really became an antagonist of the refugee children's movement over this issue of religion. Here's an example from the refugee children's movement's own files. There is a small section that was preserved on microfilm that I discovered. Again, no one else had really ever used this material. And one of the extensive case files in here was the case of this little boy named Peter Baranovitz. And he was placed with a woman who wrote this in 1942, when she had finally been contacted by the refugee children's movement, who belatedly decided that they ought to try and provide some kind of religious training for these Jewish children that were in non-Jewish homes. And his foster mother rather indignantly wrote back, "I trust by now that you've decided to leave the religious education of Peter Baranovitz to the one who has housed, clothed, and fed him for nearly 3¼ years. Nothing was mentioned about religious training by your movement when the children were first taken by me. It seems rather mean to spring it upon me now. When the child first came, I informed the parents of our attending a Baptist church, and as no comment was made to me, silence was consent." I was actually pretty surprised when I went through these records. I know these are hard to read, but every single one of these cards, and this is just a small sampling, where it says religion, there's a little square. I can't put my cursor on it. You can see that the J has been crossed out. And in every single one of these, the J has been crossed out, and there's a P here. The J has been crossed out, and it's CHR. And so a lot of these children were just, their religion was just quietly changed on their records with no particular fanfare. I really think that this is a subject that needs more intensive investigation, because it's quite clear that the religious heritage of a number of these children was abrogated by the refugee agencies and the foster parents who cared for them. The General Secretary of the Refugee Children's Movement said, you can see here in 1945, towards the end of the war, she admitted the mistake that they had made in placing many, many children with the Christadelphian community, because they realized now that it would be impossible for them not to share their religious life. And it was a surprise to me, actually, to find that she even admitted any kind of mistake in placing children in non-Jewish homes. She specified the Christadelphians, but this could quite easily be applied to other Christian sects, many of them that were overtly conversionary. A few of the children in the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund were at the center of quite a religious controversy. They had been evacuated to a small village in Devon called Tallaton. And after the war, late in the war, it was discovered that some of the children were being converted. The Refugee Children's Movement, the Board of Deputies, sent a delegation down there, and this is a part of a report of theirs, that they attempted to take the children out and move them to Jewish homes, but they had been resisted by the children, the foster parents, and the local authorities. In the end, not the boys, but the 3 girls who are not pictured here that were in the same village were all baptized in the Church of England. And many, many years later, one of them recalled, in 1949, this family adopted us, saying we had no one left. We then had to become Christian. And at the age of 20, I married a Christian man. But deep down in my heart, I am still a Polish Jewess. I think that this is one of the outcomes of family separation for these children that was particularly tragic. These are the memories of another Kindred transportee that came from Poland. And she had always told her daughter that she felt that there were 3 motivations of foster parents. So we've seen that already. One motivation was religious conversion. Her idea was that that it was for community approbation amongst the Jewish community, to get some money, or to have someone be a free maid. I think probably most people are acquainted with accounts of older kinder girls being used as unpaid maids. There are several accounts of this in the archival records of the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund, including this one of this young woman named Dorothea. This was a report of the home visitor who, a couple of years later, made this report that she was taken over by Mrs. C, where she was a cook, nurse to 4 children, housemaid and charwoman. She got no wages, had not a minute's rest. And in spite of this, her foster family / employers had to said she had to be grateful, because they regarded her as their benefactors. After 9 months, when she told them that she was leaving, she was called a dirty, ungrateful German. I think her experience was rather typical. A lot of these foster parents took an older kinder girl in because they could exploit them as a maid, and there was very little that the child could do. And you can see what happened when Dorothea left. She was almost 17 when she arrived. So when she left, she was probably 17 or 18. Um, she was called this very unpleasant thing. Going back to Peter Baranovitz, this letter from his foster mother shows that community approbation didn't just apply to Jewish community. This was when she was anxious to get this child that she had agreed to sponsor, pleading that there really is a grand time waiting for Peter. If only his parents knew it, he will have the time of his life. Do please help me. I'm tired of people saying, got your little refugee yet? She seems to have little sympathy at all with the parents back in Germany who are making this terrible decision to send their very young child away to strangers. And she wrote dozens of letters, and she was extremely possessive of this child. She, especially around the issue of religion, and she had promised and said that he was mine to raise until he was 18, as my agreement was. But in the end, as this letter dated June 24th, 1945, she wrote to the Refugee Children's Movement saying, now that hostilities have ceased in Europe, I feel I would like to be relieved of the responsibility of my charge, Peter Baranovitz. She had had him for 6 years. He was 9 years old, and she turned him out of her home. He was placed in an orphanage. And so for a child who had had to leave his own mother at the age of 3, here was another uprooting from someone, probably the only mother he knew at that point. Here's pictures of just 3 other children to whom the same exact thing happened. And I don't think people know enough about the fact that many, many children were rejected by their foster parents at some point. And both of these boys had to go into hostels, which was all right for Carol Felix. He was a little older, but for Eddie Fishbein, it was very difficult as he was quite a young child, only 5 years old when he was put into a hostel. His foster parents rejected him because he wet the bed. There are obviously accounts of foster parents who were loving and caring, and this is one from this young woman. This is a report again from the home visitor of the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund, who said that Mrs. Davis, who is childless, is very attached to Sonia. She treats her as her own daughter. She wants to adopt her and make her a British citizen. She hopes that she will be able to go to secondary school and to marry a nice English Jewish boy. In his opinion, she was in good hands and one of the best well-kept Sponsian children. But then he says, everything is not all right, even with Sonia. Her twin sister is in Birmingham with Jewish people. However, her sister's foster parents object to Sonia visiting her sister or even writing to her. This causes her much suffering and worries the kind Mrs. Davis. Sonia was with a working class family in the East End of London. Esther, her sister, had gone to a wealthy family in Birmingham. And the Birmingham Refugee Children's Committee basically supported Esther's family in keeping these girls apart. According to testimony that Sonia gave much later in life, she felt that Esther's family were ashamed of the fact that she had a sister who lived in the East End. And that when they finally were allowed to meet, which was only 5 years, for the first time, 5 years after they had arrived in England and been separated on the first day, it was because Esther came to London. Sonia was never invited to Birmingham. And this is an example of one of the letters from the Birmingham committees, basically putting off the Polish fund and saying, we can't do anything to upset these wealthy people. They're doing a nice job. And you can see here, Esther's in riding jodhpurs. I mean, she had quite a privileged life. But the outcome for these twin sisters was that their bond was permanently severed by this separation for over 5 years. There's much more to say about CARES and all of these issues, but I want to turn now to the parents because, of course, the sort of theme I'm following here is family separation. This is a picture of many of these, this last group of Pull in Action Kinder who came to England. And I have been able to identify most of these children, 90% of whom lost every member of their family in the Holocaust. Included in their files are a number of really touching letters from their parents. This is an excerpt from just one of them, a father named Simon Klarman, imploring the Polish Fund to help my children and make me happy, even if my heart weeps at the thought that I am not blessed to have my children around me, to bring them up and speak with them. If hopefully for not too long a time, I am only doing this because it is a bitter necessity. I think that the voice of these parents in these letters is hugely important because it expresses how painful a decision this was. When we look back, it seems like, oh, obvious you would want to save your children. But as Simon Klarman noted, he was only doing it because it was a bitter necessity. His letter went on to say that he hoped that his children would be placed in Jewish homes, that they would thrive, that they would grow up to be proud Jewish people. He expressed a lot of things that I imagine many, many of these parents also felt, and all of which were sadly not fulfilled in the case of his own children. He and his wife were both murdered in the Holocaust. Another father who deeply expressed his pain was this man. He's on the far right of this picture, Selig Friedman. His two little daughters, and sitting in the front row on either side of their mother, were both supposed to go on the Kindertransport. The heads of household were basically told to go back to Germany in the summer of 1939 to wrap up their affairs. And he got back to Poland. He wrote to the fund and saying that when he came back from Germany, only one of his girls, the younger one, had been taken, whereas the older one was left behind. And he wrote several letters imploring them to take his daughter, Helene. In the end, she was not taken. So Tilly was the only one of her family who made it out of Europe, out of Poland. The rest of her family was murdered in the Holocaust. As you can see from these pictures, which were lent to me by Tilly's daughter, she grew up to be a beautiful young woman. She found a very loving foster family who actually adopted her. She made a very good marriage into a wealthy Jewish family. She had two adorable children, but tragically, 2 years after this picture was taken, Tilly threw herself in front of a train. She was only 26 years old, and she had never, ever been able to reconcile the loss of her family, no matter how many advantages that she had been afforded in Britain. Her despair was too great, and that was the outcome. Similarly, Peter Baranovitz, who was apparently brilliant, he won a full scholarship to Cambridge, but he refused to take it because he was so afraid of the sort of trifecta of being Jewish, being an orphanage boy, and being a refugee that he would never fit in Cambridge. He went to university in London. He became a physician, but the trauma of being separated from his mother when he was 3, and then being rejected by his foster mother when he was 9. His mother did survive. You can see here from this picture. but he had a very conflicted relationship with her. And very sadly, he also committed suicide at the age of 37. I spoke to his widow, and she felt that he never recovered from these rejections. So again, there is this sense that these children who were afforded every advantage would somehow adjust themselves to their circumstances, but sadly, some were not able to. This is a quote from Lord Goral, who was appointed to be the guardian of all the underage kinder at the end of the war, recognizing that many of these children had no parents now. And he is echoing the Great Adventure, the book that was quoted at the very beginning of this talk, and saying that it was much more, in spite of their suffering, hardly one of the children thus brought over failed to make good. This is part of that enduring, narrative that it was this wonderful act of humanitarian rescue and these children all thrived. We can see from those examples that I just gave that this is not the case. They didn't all thrive, and many of them suffered their entire lives. However, I do need to turn now to some children, probably representing the majority of the children who did manage to come to terms with their losses and to, through their own persistence and determination, it's incredibly admirable, actually, to achieve their ambitions. So we'll go back to Bruno Nussbaum, the young boy who Elsie Zeitlin said should be an artisan, not an artist. This is a letter he wrote when he was 16. He had by this time been sent to Leeds. He was working in an architect's office, but in this letter, he is pleading with the fund to send him to college so that he can gain his Royal Institute of British Architects qualification. And he writes, "Of course, it's one of my greatest dreams to go to college and achieve the RIBA in 5 years. After the war, architects will be needed not only in England, but all over the universe. And I will get many chances to prove myself worthy of the letters behind my name. Then I will be able to prove my gratitude to the Polish Committee, which has done many good things for us." They did not send him to college. In fact, they brought him to London, put him to work in another architect's office, and then proceeded to meddle so much in his life and criticize how he was spending his time and his money that he finally cut himself off from the refugee agencies when he was 18. He joined the army, and then in 1945, he contacted the Polish Fund again to tell them that he had started a correspondence course in architecture through the army, financed by the War Office, and that this book, you can see pictured here, he's asking for help if they can please give him a grant so that he can buy this book. And in fact, they did give him the money. And I'm happy to report that he did become a qualified architect. So he was able to achieve his ambition. Another young man whose story is quite amazing was this young man, the only child of a cantor from Neustadt, Germany. He wrote this letter to his landlady, really. It was like a foster mother. And he talked about how he had given a concert and he had been a tremendous success. And he says, "Now it's the time to tell you that it's my wish to be a cantor, but I also want to have a general knowledge of music. Now, I want to hear your opinion about my plans. It seemed to me you always had an interest in my plans." The fund was actually interested in helping him become a cantor, so they had him tested, his voice and his general religious knowledge, but they decided that he was not, he wouldn't cut it, and so he was sent to work as a mechanic. He also joined the army. This is a segment from a letter from his parents, his mother. This was the last letter he got from her, saying that he should look after his interests. And it's a kind of typical letter from a parent saying, that she's thrilled that he's going to a place of safety, but trying to impart as much knowledge as she can, and sort of quotidian concerns about his suitcase and his assets and so forth. He went to Italy, and it was there he first heard opera. Here again is an excerpt from one of his parents' letters, saying that they hope to see him again. You share the fate of thousands of other children. There are many here who would like to be in your shoes but have no way of escape. Be careful in your journey and make sure nothing happens to you, and don't go near the window or water. I'm thinking of the lovely moment when your ship departs. Both his parents were murdered in the Holocaust. These letters, I found his sons. He died in 2004, and his sons lent me these letters. They found them in his father's wallet. He had carried them around with him for 70 years. So this is a picture of Henry in 1945. So this young man, who the Fund and other Jewish religious leaders had said didn't have the skills to become a cantor, came back to England and took voice training. You can see here a picture of him as a cantor, but he also became an opera singer. And his son sent me some recordings of him. This is actually him singing some cantorial music. So I'll just play a few bars of it just so you can see what a voice he had. He actually had a part in a couple of movies. He was in Sunday Bloody Sunday, and he was also in The Merchant of Venice, I believe, with Sir Laurence Olivier. So it's not that, none of the children did succeed. Many of them did, in spite of the roadblocks that were put in their way. I have a huge amount of admiration for people like Henry Danziger, who had so many traumas in his life and yet was able to achieve his goals and ambitions. So while it's true that most children did eventually come to terms with their losses, I think it's really important to listen to their voices. This is the quote from the testimony of one of the children who came on the pole in action. And she said, "I was the most miserable child in the world, but I was ashamed to say I was homesick. I thought they'd throw me out if I showed any lack of appreciation for my good fortune," quote unquote. This is a common sentiment, this feeling that they were required to be grateful and not allowed to complain about anything. You can see these are two memoirs, and these are quotes that echo these same ideas. "I still haven't recovered from the need to apologize for daring to complain. We were saved. How dare we criticize anything? It goes very deep, and we lost our confidence in being allowed to have any feelings or opinions at all." And Ruth David said, "In the countries where victims sought refuge, they found no one wanted to hear their suffering." Another woman who came from Poland on the Kindred Transport said in her testimony, "I was lucky enough not to go into a concentration camp, but my life wasn't easy. It's worse now than it was years ago. I don't know why. I can't shake it. When I was young, I was able to say, I have my children. We work to build a life, to build a home. You build, you build. And then when you're older, there's nothing to build. And all the things that were there in the back of their mind, they're somehow in the front. And I can't shake it. I can't shake it. This imperative of gratitude was a powerful one. It's a powerfully silencing force on these children, being able to articulate their own trauma, or as these Kinder said, to complain about anything. And this powerfully silencing force is in place for refugees across the ages, I think. It didn't apply just to the Kindertransportees. And so to conclude, I'd just like to say that it's difficult, I know, to turn long-held notions about the Kindertransport as a child rescue scheme on their head and think about it as an act of family separation and all the terrible consequences that we know come from family separation. But when we examined the real lived experiences of these children through both testimony and archive, it becomes clear that while it was about rescue, it was just as much about separation and loss. And my research has tried to bring some new truths about the Kindertransport to light, although many of these are kind of hard truths that don't sit well to those who are attached to narratives of rescue and salvation. Some who are most resistant to these truths include Kinder and their families, who rightly feel enormous gratitude for having their lives and the lives of their loved ones saved when so many were lost. But finally, I don't believe that there should be a binary choice between two competing narratives about the Kindertransport. Gratitude for the efforts of the British nation to bring these children out of Nazi lands can, I think, coexist with a truthful examination of the policies that enabled them to come and of their reception and their treatment after they arrived, even when those truths are painful and difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and some appreciation coming from other screens too. I'm just going to stop the screen sharing so we can all see one another. And we have about 15 or 20 minutes now for questions. And I wonder, before I start reading some of those that have come into me privately in the chat and also in the general chat, I'm going to ask something, but please do keep them coming and feel free to send them through and I will convey them. So Jennifer, I wondered if I could start with a question to you about the kind of narrative that you're presenting and how it's been received. So for some of our audience, this narrative that you're opening up, which really demythicizes the story of the Kindertransport and tries to surface, as you say, the voices of some of the children whose stories perhaps didn't fit in with that affirmative narrative of rescue and salvation. That narrative you're presenting is maybe an unexpected, possibly even an uncomfortable one. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit about how you came to this conclusion in your research. Was it something you were looking for? Was it something that came through really strongly from the material? And also just a little bit about how the findings of your research have been received by different audiences through your book and through your talks.
Great questions. Well, certainly, my first investigation was I looked at everything. I looked at it from the government's perspective. I wanted to know what was the rationale for, bringing children but not their families. And when I was doing that research, I was still living in America. I didn't have access to any of this archival material, and so I was using, as most historians have, the testimonies of Kindertransportees, which is why I'm so familiar with their testimonies and their memoirs. And this is where I came to this weird, these children are saying strong and powerful things about their own trauma, and yet there still is this very, very persistent narrative that they were rescued and that was the end of the story, and they all lived happily ever after. So that was sort of the beginning of my journey. When I found the archival materials, I tried very hard not to look for things. I thought, well, here it is. I found file after file after file. I didn't even know, I had no master list. I didn't know how much material I was going to find. And I thought, well, I will just see what does this archival material say to me? This is one of the reasons I titled my book, subtitled it Contesting Memory, because I was also contesting kinder memories. And this is, I didn't talk about this tonight, but this is a big part of my book, juxtaposing how these children remembered their experience with what the archival material said happened to them. And so there are some very interesting observations I was able to make about, in some cases, a very clear mismatch between their memories and what the archive said happened to them. And so I just let the archive speak, and it fell clearly into these four groups of correspondents: the refugee organizations, the foster carers, the children, and the parents. And I drew my conclusions from what they had to say. I mean, one of the surprising outcomes is, although Kindred don't mention the refugee agencies very much, most of what they say is fairly negative. And honestly, there are criticisms, certainly in the area of religion, that can be laid at their feet, and some of these patronizing attitudes. But in many cases, they did way more for these children than the children were even aware of at the time. So, I think this is the story that emerged. And one of my conclusions about Kindred testimony and memoir is that people can read these memoirs or listen to these testimonies, and even if they're horribly negative and the child said that they were miserable and had an awful time and so forth, in your mind you can say, well, that was the exception, 10,000 were rescued. But if the archive keeps telling you over and over again that these were the experiences of children, there is some weight to that, to those conclusions, I think. Interestingly, former Kinder themselves have been uniformly positive about this. And many of them have told me that it's hugely liberating to them, because they felt constrained in the way that those quotes showed that they could never, ever say anything negative about their experience. But some of their families, have pushed back hard on this narrative, because they're so used to just being grateful for the fact that their parent or loved one was saved, was rescued.
Right. Thank you. Well, that takes us to our first question from the audience. So James Canny raises the question. He raises a question about working with information about people, some of whom might still be alive, and he raises it as a data protection question. Should we be seeing personal information and so on? But I wonder whether it also raises broader questions about how you work with families, some of whom provided you with information. Can you say a little bit about working with live subjects, as it were, at least some of them?
Yeah, there were a lot of ethical issues I had to struggle with. For everyone that I found that was alive, of course, I asked them, if they wanted me to use their real name or anonymize them. And they all wanted me to use their real name. They were adamant about that, actually. I think that, once they got to know me and my understanding of their experience or their loved one's experience, they trusted, the account would be sensitive. In cases from the archival materials where I couldn't find anyone, or there were some sensitive things. I found a boy who was in a homosexual relationship. There were some foster parents whose own letters were incredibly damning, that really they were not good to the child that they had. And in those cases, I just made the decision to anonymize them. Because even though I was fairly sure that the foster parents were no longer alive, and technically I could have used their names, I'm sure that they didn't have a super common name, and I didn't know if they had, relatives still alive, and it wasn't my place. Although it's interesting, this one child who I'm talking about, who was so mistreated by this family, I was contacted by some relatives of hers eventually, and they didn't like my decision not to use the real name of these people. I think they really wanted them named and shamed, but I just explained that I wasn't going to do that. So yes, there are some real sensitive things. And in this question of how kinder remember their experiences versus what their file said about them, in many cases, even when presented with evidence in front of them, they insisted that that couldn't be true. There were things that I couldn't put in, that were sensitive, some sensitive information about, especially the people who sadly committed suicide. So yeah, of course, I had to struggle with a lot of um, ethical issues. Yeah,
Sounds like a really delicate balance.
it
So
was.
I have a question from Jeffrey Metzger, and I should say that I've received quite a lot of questions that are around specific aspects of the history of the Kindertransport, and likely we won't be able to get through all of them in the next kind of 12 minutes before we finish, or 10 minutes. So apologies in advance, but I will send them to Jennifer, and as she said, she's very happy to be in contact with you. If you would like to get in touch with her, I've put her email in the chat, so please do feel free to reach out to her if we don't get to your question. So Jeffrey asks, do you know about the boarding school run by Anna Essinger? She moved her school to England from Germany in 1933. She provided an excellent atmosphere for kids that came over on the Kindertransport, far better than the random possibilities that arose with assigning kids to families.
Absolutely. There are some really interesting and unique, small groups of children who had really excellent experiences. There was a family called the Schlesingers that brought over 12 children. The group that was sponsored by the Rothschild family, including Jeffrey Hartman. There clearly are some really interesting and positive experiences of small groups of children. It's very, very difficult to generalize broadly about the Kindertransport, um, as every child's experience was quite varied. I will say that I go back over and over to Karen Gershen's book, We Came as Children, the very first attempt to do a sort of collective autobiography of the Kindertransport. And although she anonymized all the accounts, they were taken in the mid 1960s when these children were about the same age as their parents had been when they sent them away, and they were in the prime of their lives and so forth. And it's a heartbreaking book. I mean, there are not a tremendous amount of positive accounts in that book. So um, of course, I'm not saying that. I mean, there are lucky, fortunate children like Elsbeth Hirstein and the children that went to Anna Eisinger's school for sure. But I would say, in the main, the experiences were far more bumpy.
So Naomi Caligaro asks a question about Jewish families. She says, were there Jewish families in Britain who were able and willing to give homes to these children? And if so, why were they not prioritized as foster parents for the children?
This is one of the enduring questions. One of the excuses that has always been given by the refugee children's movement, its successor agencies, and apologists for the refugee children's movement is that not enough Jewish families came forward. Solomon Schoenfeld always maintained that that was not the case. I tend to think from looking in his archive that he may have been right. The problem was that the vast majority of the Jewish families lived in London or one of the other major urban centers, such as Manchester or Leeds. And the government had made it quite clear to the refugee agencies that they wanted these children as widely dispersed about the country as possible. So as basically not to let anybody know how many children were coming in and avoid anti-Semitism. So a lot of willing Jewish families, I think, didn't get to take a child because, that would mean that virtually all of the children would have ended up in London and Manchester. However, groups like the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund and the West London Synagogue never placed a child in a non-Jewish home. But as soon as war came, and if that Jewish family lived in a city, those children were evacuated out of those Jewish homes. So even groups that intended to place children in Jewish homes those plans were thrown into disarray with the coming of war and the mass evacuation of children. However, Schoenfeld, and this is really where the refugee children's movement kind of fell down in not keeping Jewish contact with a lot of these widely dispersed children. Schoenfeld maintained that should have been possible. And I actually found a file in his vast archive in which he had written to every single, local council in the entire country, inquiring whether they had Jewish children Jewish evacuees, especially refugee children, and were they being provided with Jewish education and so forth. So he really made the effort, but a lot of children fell through the cracks.
Mm. Okay, so a quick empirical question. There's a couple of questions about other countries that received kids. Was Canada one of them? What other countries received kids?
Small handfuls of kids got to Sweden, to France, to Belgium, to various places. There was no concerted effort similar to this in any other country. It was proposed to the United States. A bill was drawn up but never made it out of committee in Congress to bring 20,000 Jewish children to the United States. Interestingly, one of the big objections to that was the issue of family separation, because again, they were not considering bringing the parents as well. Canada, I don't think, took any Jewish children, which is interesting because Canada had taken a lot of British children from orphanages, the rather now well-renowned movement of children from Britain to the Dominions, Canada and Australia. There was an evacuation scheme for British children to go to Canada once the Blitz started, but I found evidence in the parliamentary record that the refugee children were excluded from that. So I don't think Canada took very many children at all. Now, Kindred transportees did end up in Canada, but only those that were interned. So several boys from the Polish Fund were interned because they couldn't convince the authorities that they were Polish, not German, and they were sent to Canada as prisoners of war.
Right. So Eugene McConnell asks the next question. He says, some of the accounts are heartbreaking, others heartwarming. Is the issue around the difference between the public chauvinistic story of how brilliantly humanitarian Britain had been to rescue, rehome, and virtually resurrect 10,000 children, and on the other hand, the reality of the varied experiences of the children? I think that quite succinctly sums up
it does
what
indeed.
You were trying to do.
Absolutely. Again, the bottom line is it's true. These children's lives were saved, but you can also ask at what cost. Could things have been different? Certainly. But I do think that, especially since right now, or for the last few years, ever since the Middle East refugee crisis, has come to the fore, the issue of family separation is a very urgent one. Clearly, the United States is still grappling with, family separations. I just read yesterday that over 4,000 children were separated from their parents at the border during the Trump presidency. We now know, that family separation is horribly, horribly traumatic. I don't think that they didn't know that at the time. So I think that it's valid to examine the Kindertransport from that perspective, from family separation perspective, as well as rescue.
Thank you. Yes, subject for another talk, but there are so many contemporary resonances, and indeed, the Kindertransport has surfaced so much in the discourse around refugees, and especially refugee children, hasn't it?
Yes, and because it has preserved this aura of being only framed as a rescue operation, people have tended to romanticize it and put it up as some kind of model. And so I think it's important to keep reminding people it was a family separation scheme, the ultimate family separation scheme, and the fact that the majority of these children were permanently separated from their families.
Thank you. Well, so given time, I still have many more questions on my list, both that have been sent to me and also in the general chat. And I apologize for not being able to get to all of them. I did want to relay just a comment from David Shapiro, who says that on a website called gatheringthevoices.com, they have testimonies from several kinder, including, it seems, David's mother, who had a comparatively good experience, but also others who were closer to your findings. So that's perhaps a helpful resource for others who are interested in that. And
before we go, Shirley, I'm just
yes.
looking at one on the chat here.
Mm-hmm.
How do you account for possible archival bias? I don't necessarily think that there's archival bias. I think what this person is asking about is testimonial bias, that people have a greater incentive to write or create a written record when they're unhappy, want something, wish to criticize. And this is what was one of my concerns, because previous academic histories about the Kindertransport were based mostly on testimony. And of course, people who take the time to give a testimony or to write an account, we can't know whether those are, indicative of a broader experience. But finding the files of a random selection of Kindertransportees who have a fairly wide group of experiences does tend to even out that bias, I think, a little bit. Especially amongst the files of the refugee children's movement that I discovered, the ones where, for instance, the religion was changed, because this was just a random selection of files from one home visitor in the Birmingham area. And, well, even the files of the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund, because they spanned something I didn't really even talk about, is different experiences of the different aged children. Younger children tended to be more traumatized by separation from their families than older children did. So, I mean, in my book, I do talk about the age difference, gender differences, even different experiences in different kinds of foster placements. Some amount of kinder went to relatives or, very distant relatives. And they had very specific experiences in relatives' homes that no one has ever really sort of parsed out. What was it like for a child who didn't go into a stranger's home, but went into a relative's home? So the archives actually enabled me to get, pretty granular in analyzing the different experiences of groups of kinder.
Well, thank you. I mean, there are more questions, and I think they're all testament to the great interest that your book and your research has aroused. So thank you again so much for speaking to us, for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, for taking the time to talk to us. Again, I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but do feel free to be in touch with Jennifer. Also, if you have family stories about refugee domestics, as we said before, she'd love to hear from you in her research for her present book. I put again a link in the chat to her book if you are interested in buying it. A reminder too to join our mailing list for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. We have some great upcoming events. We have a course starting on Friday looking at the early years of Zionism before the Balfour Declaration. Also, Lady Esther Gilbert will be giving a talk on the 1st of July about Sir Martin and some of the fantastic historical trips he led, which should be a fantastic event. So please do register for that, and we hope to see you on one of our events again soon. And in the meantime, thank you again for joining us. Wishing you all a pleasant evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are. And Jennifer, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.